Hello and welcome back to the Karma Stories podcast. I'm Rob and I hope you are having a wonderful day today. Today I have 3 stories for you from the Malicious Compliance subreddit. Do you like cookies? Because if you do, all you have to do is subscribe on YouTube or follow us on your favorite podcasting platform. And then let us know that you did in a comment. And I'll make sure you get your cookies. Trust me. Alright, on to today's stories. Let's jump right in. This story comes to us from Catless Boy Mom. Lowest possible fare, lowest possible rate. Back before cell phones and TSA checkpoints, I was working as an admin assistant. Ray was my development head and had a great sense of humor. When I was hired on, Ray made sure I understood that I worked for him. Even though I would do some office-wide work, he was my boss. Clint was in charge of another department in our office. Flying from our office to a satellite office for a day or two was common for people in both departments, and I was in charge of making standard, pre-approved travel arrangements. If someone needed to change unexpectedly, they were supposed to handle those themselves. Clint seemed unable to understand that. At some point, Clint decided that he wanted to cut travel costs. Lowest possible fare, lowest possible rate for his department. Lowest possible fares were always the 5 a.m. outbound and 11 p.m. return flights. Clint didn't care. A couple weeks into this policy, Clint is to head into the satellite office for some in-person meetings. Game on! Lowest possible fare, lowest possible rate. Clint left on the 5 a.m. flight. The lowest rate car rental company didn't keep their cars available at the airport. Clint had to take the shuttle to their off-site location to pick up his car. Sadly for Clint, the shuttle didn't start running until 8, when his first meeting was scheduled to start. Oops. The client refused to reschedule that day, but agreed to the next morning. At some point, it dawned on Clint that he either had to fly home and back, or get a room for the night. He chose to get a room, and of course, called me. One lowest possible rate room coming up. Unsurprisingly, that room didn't have security on site like he was used to. It did have little multi-legged friends if his complaints were true. The next morning, Clint headed out in the previous day's suit only to discover that his car had been broken into overnight. The police took their time arriving, and by the time they were done, Clint had missed his meeting again. Somehow, Clint got the client to reschedule again, and he decided to take the flight home and back the next day. Of course, I was kind enough to remember the lowest possible fare rule, so Clint was booked on the 11 p.m. flight home and 5 a.m. return, even though his meeting was midday. This time, the lowest rate car was at the airport, so Clint got to skip the shuttle. Sigh, you can't win them all. At this point, Clint's lowest possible policy had already cost the company at least double what a normal trip would have. Not to mention all the time I had spent calling hotels, motels, and car rental companies. The next day, he's on the 5 a.m. flight and makes it to his meeting. I don't know when he realized that he didn't want the lowest possible fare at 11 p.m. I do know he decided to take the more expensive, earlier flight home both days. Somehow, he discovered that he could change that himself. The next time I saw Clint, he tried to fire me. Too bad, I worked for Ray, who knew and laughed about the whole thing. Clint was furious, but there wasn't anything he could do. The company would back Ray, and Ray was backing me. Clint changed the room rate policy because of his experience, but refused to rescind the lowest fare and lowest rental rate policy. That was until accounting let slip that not only had Clint figured out how to take the higher-priced earlier flight, he figured out an upgraded seat as well. Clint found himself with an entire department intentionally missing their 5 a.m. flights and rebooking for the more expensive 8 a.m., which somehow only had upgraded seats available every time. Rental car reservations were missed, and more expensive cars were rented. Meetings that were previously in the office were somehow only available after hours, so clients were taken to dinner. Dinner included alcohol, so rooms were booked at hotels closest to the restaurants, and returning flights scheduled for the next day. Less than a month later, all the lowest price policies were rescinded. I was allowed to book normally again, and the missed flights, upgraded seats, and fancy hotels disappeared. Dinner meetings remained, but decreased dramatically. When I left, Clint's reputation still hadn't recovered. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, there's one from a user called Travel Girl. It says, as a corporate travel agent, I approve. Most companies have a policy to select the lowest fare flight within a 2-hour window of when the flights are needed. That way, the traveler doesn't have unreasonable flight times or connections, and the company is still able to save on cost. OP responded to this one and said, I usually did lowest reasonable and was allowed to figure in a certain amount of convenience and safety. Evidently, Clint needed to learn that the hard way. I love how in this story, Clint thought he could get away with changing things and making the policy not apply to him. It's rules for thee, but not for me in this case. But they didn't realize that everybody under them could do the exact same thing. Way to go for Clint's whole team for sticking it to their boss. This story comes to us from Sia Moose. Pay your staff less than your colleagues? Lose them all. I'm going to try and keep this kind of vague because 1. I like the elected official as a person, just not as a boss. 2. I like what they're trying to accomplish in terms of policy. And 3. I don't want this to blow back on me because I'm still in this field. I have spent most of my career working for elected officials. Over the course of my career, I have worked for elected officials at the federal, state, and local level in progressively more involved policy roles. In between, I have done some higher paying private sector jobs, but I have twice taken pay cuts to return to public service working for electeds because I genuinely love the work. The flip side of that is that it has been hard to afford to live in my area on that lower salary. Earlier this year, I was still making less than my last job after 2 years in the office. In early spring, we were talking with one of our colleagues on the shared staff, and she made an offhand comment about how our office had the worst pay of any office for our legislative body. She ended up sharing information about how much other offices pay their staff with our whole office. Turns out, she was more right than she knew. Our office had some of the most experienced staff of any office, and bar none, the lowest pay, even relative to less experienced offices that were less active. Our highest paid staff, other than our manager, didn't crack the 40th percentile on our floor, despite 20 years of experience. I topped out in the 30th percentile for pay, with 8 years relevant experience. I would estimate the average is closer to 3 to 5 years experience for my level of pay. Colleagues I had worked with previously, who I knew had 3 fewer years of experience, were making 20% more than I was with similar or less involved responsibilities. So I did a full analysis of the pay on my floor relative to experience and set up a meeting with the elected to discuss salary, which did not go well. I was told that aside from annual increments, there would be no pay raises, and essentially that I should be happy I had a job. The fact that I had been loyal was irrelevant, as was the fact that anytime there was some weird issue we wanted to explore, I was able to find a solution. Me making less than colleagues in other offices with less experience was not their problem. I was told that if I wanted more pay, I would have to find something new. So after telling my colleagues about the ugly meeting, I did exactly that. I started applying for other jobs in our government, found one that I was highly qualified for, got an interview almost immediately, aced the interview, and 3 months later, the hiring process is a joke, started with a 65% increase in take-home pay. After hearing about how poorly my salary meeting went, my colleagues didn't bother having their own meetings and just started their own searches. Come the start of the next legislative body after the elections, the only person left will be a new hire that started right before this nonsense went down, and a new comms person who started right after I left. Anyone with institutional knowledge about how the body functions or any knowledge about the policy issues they care about has either left or has accepted a new position. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, there's one from a user called Erasor. It says, honestly, it's hard for me to think this elected is actually in it for their constituents if this is how they treat people in their circle. OP responded to this one and said, their argument was that they could spread their budget further and better serve their constituents by having more lower paid staff, which has its merits, but also makes it hard to keep good staff, so you have a lot of turnover. They also made some poor decisions in hiring, which exacerbated feelings among staff. There are other offices that have the opposite problem, where they just have a couple of highly paid staff that can't do much of anything. Another commenter down below called YParticle said, "This is how almost all businesses operate today. Loyalty means nothing. Quit regularly to keep your pay commensurate with your skills. I've even been hired back at the same place more than twice. The secret was working elsewhere in between." OP responded to this one and said, "Yeah, finally hit my limit for that noise. Also, tired of my employment being linked to someone else's electoral chances." The nice thing about the new position is that they really seem to care about paying their staff well, compensating any overtime with comp time, and helping their staff grow. Can we reverse back to the beginning of this one for a moment, where OP said that they like the elected official, and they consider them a friend. They like them as a person. But this is a person who said, OP should be happy they have a job. Hey OP, I think we see things very differently on which people we want to keep close to us and which people we think are actually good people. This story comes to us from Taxman Retired. "You won't pay me for being bilingual, so which language should I work in?" This happened back in the late 1990s. I had worked for the government at the lowest paid position for 5 years. Due to the high unemployment and fluctuation of workloads, I would be temporarily promoted to 3 or even 4 positions above my base position for between 3 to 8 months at a time. I was very lucky because when the layoffs came every year, I was always their cutoff and managed to stay employed without a break in service during this time. I am bilingual, and so every person I interacted with would be spoken to in the language they started talking to me in. There were 2 ladies in our HR who had an argument over which was my mother tongue. They called me into HR and asked me if I was French or English. I told them it didn't matter, I was completely bilingual. They insisted that I choose one based on my early schooling, which was done in English. I was then sent on language testing for French, which I passed to their satisfaction. Suddenly, I had a slightly bigger paycheck than I had anticipated, and was told that I was eligible for the bilingual bonus as I worked on files and dealt with people in both languages. During my entire tenure, I worked in both English and French. The perk amounted to about $32 every 2 weeks, so not really a huge bonus, but enough to get an extra case of beer. Fast forward 6 years, I was transferred to a much larger office in lieu of being laid off, but at my base salary. My immediate supervisor was 1 level higher than I was, but she was drunk with her perceived power. I met her on my first day, and it was quite bizarre. She stomped into our work area. There were 3 others plus me, hopped up on a table, and stood there yelling at the top of her voice, "Get over here, come on, hurry up." When the 4 of us were in front of her looking up, she began wagging her finger at each of us in turn, like we were naughty kids at daycare, yelling that there were forms that needed to be completed and sent to certain places, and that we had to do it properly, or there would be hell to pay, etc., and so on. When she stopped yelling to breathe, I calmly put my hand up and asked her, "Are these new procedures, or are you angry that they haven't been done properly?" Remember, this was my first day, and I had never even met her. I was not going to be chastised for something that I wasn't even there for. She glared at me, infuriated that I would ask a question in one of her meetings, and she began to berate me. I tuned her out and sat waiting for the meeting to be over. I knew this was a bad job situation, but I kept my mouth shut and took notes. About 6 weeks into this childishly stupid situation, I received my paycheck, and I was short almost $100. I looked it over very carefully and discovered that not only was I not being paid my bilingual bonus, but that they were clawing back the bilingual bonus I had received the 2 paychecks before. I approached my supervisor to ask why this had happened. She said, "Little people like you, at your level, don't qualify for a bilingual bonus, so tough. Now get back to work or I will write you up." I made an appointment to speak with her supervisor, who was 2 levels above her. He said, "I don't have time for these petty arguments. What the hell are you complaining about? You get free parking." Yes, he swore first. I shouted at him rather rudely, "What the F does free parking have to do with this? I don't own an effing car." I was furious, not only because I had been denied my bilingual bonus, but that they did not consider me to be worth speaking with. Their attitude made it quite clear that they believed that they were the top dogs in the hierarchy, and I was less than a peon. Cue malicious compliance. I walked into my boss's office first thing the next morning, and I do absolutely no work until she arrives. She tells me to get to work. I told her that I needed to know which language I was supposed to work in. She says it doesn't matter, I can work in both. I insist on seeing, in writing, my language of work. It takes her 20 minutes to find the right paperwork, but finally, she stabs her finger down on a piece of paper and goes, "There, you're in an English-only position. Now get out of here and work." I calmly walk back to my workstation, and I work all day long, but when I see a form I'm supposed to stamp and file in French, I simply place it in a growing pile on my desk. I work 9.5 hours a day, so that I could leave early on Thursdays and have Fridays off. At the end of my day, I clean and lock up my work area and head into her office with a pile of papers that was just under a meter in height. I drop my load on her desk, and some of it falls over onto her paperwork. She is pissed. "What the hell is this?" I smiled as I calmly said, "It's all your French crap," and I turned and left for the day. The entire office could hear her cursing at me and screaming for me to get back there and clean it up. I laughed quietly to myself as I stood waiting for my bus, planning on enjoying my long weekend. The next day, Friday, my friend called and told me that she was furious and was going from crying to yelling to just sitting there. Monday morning, I showed up at work and am greeted by her boss. He told me that I had a bad attitude and that he was going to lay me off because there were cutbacks coming, and that he was going to give me 2 weeks' notice when the budget was finalized. I was not surprised, so I spent the morning looking for other opportunities and positions to apply for. I didn't do a single bit of work, and my boss never poked her head out of her office. Later that afternoon, I receive a call from HR, and I'm thinking, crap, here it comes. But instead, I am told that the competition for a position that I had applied for was completed, and because I had landed in the top 10 of the English position and in second position in the French position, I had the choice of which office I wanted to work in. I was very happy because I could choose to work at my old office with all my friends. I danced around the office a little, and no one could miss the absolute joy on my face. I spent the next 2 weeks doing absolutely nothing, and my bosses just ignored it because, bonus! The position I took was 2 levels higher than my supervisor's boss, and he was required to ask for my permissions to change anything in his office. My former supervisor was demoted because of my complaints to the union, and she lost her bilingual bonus. I started in the mailroom and learned so much about the organization that I was able to be placed anywhere and work effectively. I had a degree and a certificate in 2 polar opposite fields of study before I started working here. Just because someone is working for minimum wage, it doesn't mean that they are stupid and you can treat them like crap, because you never know, they just might be your boss one day. Although I was very upset at the way I had been treated, I never used my position to be punitive to them. I could have easily done so without any suspicion, but nah, they needed to learn how a boss should treat their staff, not be subjected to abuse. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, there's one from a user called Random Browsing Today. It says, moral of the story, be careful of the toes you step on. It may be connected to the butt you have to kiss someday. I actually just noticed that OP did a little update down in the comments. It says, from what I learned afterwards, she had been mentored by her old boss who ran the unit like a prison camp. Her recommendation for the position was built on this fact. The management style was just starting to change from blind obedience to micromanaging employees' time to a more individual employee plan, taking advantage of the employee's ingenuity and a trade-off for exact time clocking. When I started the job, everyone started at 7:30 and ended at 3. Bells rang for morning and afternoon breaks, and lunch was set. I had explained to them that a staggered break and lunchtime was beneficial to everyone, as the office would have 0 downtime over these periods, and employees could have time to order a meal in the cafeteria and eat it before they had to be back to their desks. Their first question to me was, how do we know that the employees aren't goofing off and taking 2 breaks and lunches? I tried to explain that the employees weren't 4 years old and were in fact adults who understand you shouldn't try to take advantage of their employer, because they would get fired. Some people just don't want to believe that other people are basically good. Oh well, their loss, because they wanted trained rubber stamping monkeys, not employees. Alright, well, I can say this as a Canadian that it definitely sounds like this person is working in the Canadian federal government because they generally don't seem to know what they're doing, especially under current leadership. But he's on his way out, so we won't comment too much more on that. One thing I do want to say though, it sounds like OP kept a really positive attitude through this whole thing, and that says a lot about OP, especially when they're trying to work in the Canadian federal government. If you enjoy daily Reddit stories, I encourage you to follow and give us a rating on whichever podcasting platform you enjoy the most. And if you're watching and listening on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button and drop a like on the video. It really helps us out. I thank you for watching and listening. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you tomorrow.